So I wanted to do first was introduce the panel. We've got a great panel here, many of different perspectives. So let me just introduce each of these. Bob Pepper is sitting next to me. Bob runs the global policy programs at Cisco. I think Bob came from the FCC sometime in the past, and really Bob's a big driver of these national programs, driver of the policy, and he's going to really be one of the experts that talks about the impact of bandwidth needs on policy. Next to Bob, we have Minister Ivanovski. He is the Minister of Information Society for the Republic of Macedonia. They've done some amazing programs in Macedonia. I've been there many times, seen some of these programs. He's going to share those because it's an area where government policy can make an enormous difference to the number of people that can be connected and the services they receive. So next to Minister Ivanovski, there is Juan. He's from the AHCIET, so the coordinator for the AHCIET Center of Studies, Iberoamerican, although I think most of his time is spent on Latin America and these Association of Research Centers in Telecom Enterprises. So he'll give us a perspective from Latin America. And at the very far side of the stage, we have Carlos Lopez. He's the managing partner of management consulting of KPMG Mexico. Carlos has a lot of experience in enterprise, in services, in cloud services, and he'll give us a perspective from reaching a lot more people with many different services around here, and I think your focus is going to be mainly Mexico.
Thank you.
So we'll cover all of them. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the need for broadband. I think everyone realizes from studies and publications that Inter-American Development Bank has said if you can get 10 points up in the broadband in Latin America, it's going to be worth about 3 points on GDP, over 2% on productivity. I think every one of us knows this is a major impact, not just on economy, but on social programs, on education, on healthcare, on reaching people with government services. So the impact of broadband, I think, is absolutely known and critical, and the benefits. And the one really opening comment I do want to make is that in many areas, it's worked wonderfully, where you see it's completely transformed the financial service industry. We no longer go to banks and get our money out of lockboxes and carry it around. None of us could be at this conference if we worked that way. But in many of the other areas, like the education and some of the other, it just hasn't reached the number of people it needs to reach across the planet to drive the transformation in that industry. So we're going to look at 4 subjects here. The first one is the impact of government policy on investment in broadband. The second one is going to be the importance of national, regional, and local agendas. The third subject will be the feasibility of reaching the lower income people, the rural people. I'll put them in the category of the people that are underserved, that have the lower penetrations. And the fourth area is key programs and key practices from around the globe that are driving increased deployments, increased uses, those best practices that can be shared and used in Latin America, and many of them come from Latin America. So that's what we're going to spend our time on. We'll have time to go to the audience for questions on this, and there are some mics that can be brought around to each of you. So I want to start this off, calibration really. I'm going to go to Bob on this one because Cisco has done an amazing set of reports. I think you do these every year.
Yep.
And what they do is they talk about where bandwidth needs are going, what kind of growth rates we're going to need to support what's going to be needed globally. So I think you can probably set the stage for us, Bob. We've given us a few factoids on what kind of bandwidths are going to be needed.
Yeah. No, thank you, John, and thank you, to Witsa and Jim. It's really a great program. In fact, the time sharing of having to be in too many places at once because there's a lot of great stuff going on. So I've really enjoyed the last 3 days and learned a lot. In terms of trying to set the stage by looking at trends, this is what we call our Visual Networking Index study. It's a 5-year rolling forecast. We've been doing this for 9 years, so we actually can go back and check to see, how accurate the forecast was, and we're usually within 10%, with which is actually quite good given the dynamic nature of the market. So I'm going to cover several areas in terms of trends. The first, the data explosion is continuing, and the implication of that is that the networks, the investment in networks are just going to have to continue. Let me just put a little bit of size around that. In terms of globally, right, we're seeing for internet traffic growing at a compounded annual growth rate of 23%. That's 23% year over year over year. In Europe, it's 21%. In Latin America, it's 20%. So globally, for markets such as Latin America, North America, that have already begun, we're looking at a 20 to 22, 23% compounded annual growth rate. But in markets like India, where we're still adding a lot of people who were never connected, the CAGR, the compounded annual growth rate in India is 40% per year, year over year over year. Just think about the type of investment that's needed to meet that demand. 23% is big enough. What's driving it? Video. We're forecasting that video by 2018 will be about 75% of the content running across the global internet. Second, we talk about these as averages. Average is not the right way to think about this, because what we see today is that the peak hour, which comes sometime between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m., depending upon the country and the culture, peak hour traffic is 2.5 times average hour. But by 2018, we're forecasting peak hour is going to be about 3.5 times average. And as you can see from that, the peak hour traffic is growing at a faster compounded annual growth rate than the average traffic. Second, wireless has become absolutely essential. The way people connect their devices, like these things, to the internet. I'm talking about internet traffic, not all IP traffic. IP traffic also includes, data centers and enterprise. But in terms of how people connect their devices, what we're seeing globally is 76% of the traffic is connected by wireless. In Europe, it's 80%. Latin America, it's 80%. India, it's going to be 87%. Let me break that down, though. Definitional. Mobile data. That's to a device like this that has a SIM in it. And it's the data that goes to my SIM-enabled device over the macro cell network. Globally, well, let me just focus on Latin America, because that's where we are. We're in Mexico, right? Mobile data will be 15% of the total and is growing at a 66% compounded annual growth rate. Mobile data that could be going to the SIM device but goes to Wi-Fi, we call that Wi-Fi offload, right? I have this, my iPhone set on Wi-Fi here in the expo hall, right? So it could go to the macro cell, but it's connecting for data to the Wi-Fi here in the hall, right? That here in Latin America is going to be about another 10% of total, and that's growing at 84% compounded annual growth rate. Pure Wi-Fi to a device with no SIM is growing, is going to be about 54%, is growing at an 18% compounded annual growth rate. So what about fixed? In Latin America, fixed traffic for the internet to connect devices is only going to be about 21%, and it's only growing at about a 6% compounded annual growth rate. Wireless has become absolutely essential for the way people are connecting their devices.
Okay. So let me ask you just one question on that, Bob. You're saying that the wireless is going to grow dramatically. These numbers are massive.
Yeah.
You have 5-year projections. So when you're meeting with government policymakers, what do you tell them to do to get prepared for this?
You need spectrum, and you need spectrum that is not just for the mobile macro cell, right? People understand that, but also we're going to need the next generation of small cell Wi-Fi up at 5 gigahertz and some of the things that are moving there. It also means to get more spectrum for next generation mobile, which is LTE. That is driving the digital television transition to clear 700 megahertz, 800 megahertz, depending upon where in the world, and convert that for LTE 4G. Some of the countries in Latin America are leading. We're going to be seeing that here in Mexico. Colombia is probably leading the region. Brazil is moving. But there are other countries in the region that are lagging. Countries that lag on the digital TV transition are going to be left behind in terms of having enough spectrum for next generation.
So they'll struggle on that. So let's go one level deeper and go into Latin America. Let me go to Juan Jung, because you're looking at this area between, government policy and the private investment that's needed in the networks and the wireless. Tell us a little bit about how you see that from Latin America.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you for the organization for inviting AHCIET to be part of this important conference and this important panel. Broadband, as we already know, constitutes a powerful force for economic and social development, and emerging economies like Latin American cannot afford to fall behind either in the rollout or in the policy towards broadband networks and services. Latin America has experienced recent advances in terms of investment and on penetration rates, but we are still some way to go to reach our main objective, that is to connect everybody. Currently in Latin America, we have only half of the people that uses internet. In contrast, in Europe, that number is around 75%. And only 34% of the households of Latin America have broadband connection, in contrast to 70%, that is the number in Europe. So in AHCIET, we ask ourselves the question if it was possible for this region to close that gap to the most advanced economies from now to 2020. And we produced a research, a study in that sense, taking Europe as a benchmark. And we find out through our estimations that to reach European connectivity levels in 2020, it will take an important amount of investment, $400,000 million through that year. But more important than that, that number, it is at 10% over what the trend would suggest if we continue the way we are. So it is a considerable effort, and governments and companies will have an essential role in that way. Companies competing, investing, innovating, and governments providing a propitious framework that will be needed to facilitate this investment and infrastructure deployment. I'm thinking perhaps on legal certainty, moderate taxation levels, spectrum availability, administrative simplification for deployment, etc. But there is a key issue that I want to focus on, that is that this framework and policies and regulation will have to take into account the nature and the key transformations that we are seeing in the digital ecosystem of Internet. The digital ecosystem is a whole. Inside there you have all the actors of the Internet value chain. Among those, there are two that are very important, that are ISPs and OTTs. So what we believe is that you cannot analyze the telecommunications sector in an isolated way. That vision is long gone. Now we have a digital ecosystem that is a whole that is evolving time after time, and we need to understand the economy inside that digital ecosystem. We must take into account that data traffic has been increasing considerably due to more users and more intensiveness in the use from current users. Consumer patterns are changing. Broadband networks have not been able to grow at the same rate, in part because of the time needed for deployment, in part because of economy reasons. The ARPUs, that are the revenue that the companies get from the users, are decreasing in the world, and in Latin America we have some of the lowest levels in the world. And at the same time, we see tendencies that are moving the central power toward the OTTs inside that digital ecosystem. The OTTs are mostly located in the US, mostly unregulated, in most cases are oligopoly market structures, and used to create closed interactive systems. OTTs are increasingly offering substitute services to those of traditional telecom, but they are not subject to the regulatory requirements in most cases that the telecom industry is. So what we think is that we have a market distortion created by outdated regulation, and the framework for the future to be able to reach the objectives that we need, we have to take that into account and to align incentives. The future will bring us something that we can call a perfect storm, in the sense that we will have further data growth, further trend towards IP communication, we have the Internet of Things, machine to machine, the number of devices connected will grow exponentially. All that will require more bandwidth, we will require more investments. We have pressures to ensure higher quality levels, but at the same time, prices are decreasing and the ARPUs are decreasing. So there is an economy problem that we need to take into account in this process. How we can tackle this situation? We believe that regulatory flexibility may help us in this sense, in order to look for a level playing field inside the digital ecosystem. We need to think of softer and smarter regulation that may ensure principles of fair, equal, and non-discriminatory treatment for all market players, to look for a level playing field among regulated and unregulated players. We need a balance and avoid asymmetries as we are seeing in some cases. Things like regulation on data protection, on privacy, on taxation, must be established by the services and not by who is providing those services. That is an important concept for us. Competition must not be distorted inside the digital ecosystem, and if we ensure equitable rules for business to create environment, and in that environment, through competition and innovation, that situation led to a better outcome to the citizens, and we will be closer to reach our goals of making the investment happen and connecting the people.
Okay. So let's move to a minister level. I'll move to a country level. Minister Ivanovski, you've spent a lot of time obviously on the regulation, you own that side, but I know whenever I speak to you, you're talking about how I'm going to reach more Macedonians, how we're going to reach more people in the country with broadband and bring them into the internet economy. And so you see the private side of this as well. Can you give us your perspective there, the balance between the regulation, the government policy, and the investment of the companies in your country, and what you see globally as well?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. Republic of Macedonia, I can just give you a quick history that in 2006, the internet penetration in our country was around 12%, and PC usage or computer usage in the homes were 10%. So when my government got in power, we immediately decided to make a reform in the telecommunication sector by creating a policy which will liberalize the telecom sector and be a market that can create a fair and competitive to everyone that wants to play a fair game. So some of the changes that we did, we immediately released a third mobile operator. Previously we only had two. And the spectrum that Bob was talking about, we gave it for almost free, very low cost, but with the obligation for that mobile operator to invest in CapEx, to invest in a good infrastructure where the services for the citizen will be at good quality. And we can see that 7 years later, this third mobile operator that started in 2007, which is Telecom Austria VIP, now is the second largest mobile operator with 28% market share. So they've done a good job growing in 7 years, and we can see that the prices of the broadband, of smart devices, of internet for the home user, for every citizen, has gone way down. And the competition has done that if you have a fair legislation that it creates and stimulates competition, I think the market will do its own job. In addition to that, we started focusing more on where the future is going. So besides the issuing of 3G licenses back in those days, last year, in June of 2013, Macedonia switched from analog to digital TV, and we did it overnight. It was on the 1st of June. And we did it because the 800 megahertz spectrum is the best spectrum for mobile operators. It's called the digital dividend. And immediately after we switched from analog to digital TV, we released 3 licenses for 4G on 800 megahertz. Similarly, we gave these licenses for a cheap price, I should say, a lower cost. I think for 10 megahertz, we gave it for 10 million euros each, but also with the agreement that they will invest in a capex and it will create an infrastructure where within 4 years they will have 70% territory coverage of Macedonia with a 4G network. And today we have 2 operators there working on 4G, and 1 operator is about to start the end of 2014. So immediately we see increase in the internet penetration, we immediately see decrease in some of the packages, there are more options for the citizens, and we see that the telecom sector is continuing to grow in Macedonia. So today, or I should say the first quarter of 2014, we have close to 66% of internet penetration in the homes and close to 66% of computer penetration in the homes. But I forgot to mention that in 2006, one of the first government session, we lowered the value-added tax to computer devices. It was 18%, now it's 5%. And that's another policy that stimulates the private sector, stimulates the citizens to become ICT literate and to use more of the devices. And the latest policy that we created, that we made changes to the legislation for electronic communication, we created something what's called a one-stop shop for the telecom operators, for the broadband operators. Where previously, whenever they wanted to dig to put infrastructure, they had to go to 5 different institutions to get a license from one municipality, to get a license from the central government, to get a license from the regulator. We created this one-stop shop. They only go to the regulator whenever they need to invest in an infrastructure which will stimulate the broadband penetration in Macedonia. And right now we can see that this speeds up the process of installing broadband, and also it decreases the cost for the private sector because they save on time, they save on going to institutions, and it makes the whole system more efficient. So this one-stop shop was created in a legislation just in order to speed up the process of the broadband communication in Republic of Macedonia. And some of the policies that we set up was that we give vouchers to the graduating students of the universities. We did it for 3 years in a row, where the first year each voucher was worth 200 euros, which is close to $260. The 1 year was worth close to $300. So immediately they can buy a laptop and broadband connectivity. This was again to stimulate them, because they're graduating, immediately they have to enter the workforce, and with today's economy, not knowing ICT, it's challenging to find a job. And for Macedonia, where we have 2.2 million population, we cannot compete with quantity, we can only compete with quality of education and talented workforce. Thanks, John.
So this is a perfect example where I think it's an amazing story, where you go from 2006 and 12% penetration is a very emerging economy level of penetration, whereas 66% penetration 7 or 8 years later is up in the OECD levels of penetration. And there isn't a lot of examples. I struggle to name more than 1 or 2 or 3 that have actually changed that quickly. And I think the secret there was your policies were focused to some extent on demand. Obviously you're a regulator, but it was, I'm not going to maximize the revenue here, I'm going to maximize the people that are connected.
Yes, in a way that we have to act as a referee between the telecom sector and the citizens. You don't want to create a policy that can damage the sector and bankrupt the sector, because that's not good for the overall economy. But also you don't want to allow the telecom sector to impose prices on the citizens where there's no growth, there's only profit for the telecom sector and for their shareholders. So you have to balance it. You want to have a healthy, competitive telecom sector, but also you have to have citizens which can afford the packages, which can be shoulder to shoulder with the Western developed world, because at the end, the economy that we are all struggling to grow and to create new jobs is very much stronger if you focus on the small and medium enterprises. And these small and medium enterprises were the ones usually who were paying the higher price versus the large enterprise, whatever it comes to any package of broadband, voice, data, you name it.
Excellent. So I want to switch the subjects and go to the second one and talk about the importance of national, regional and local plans and I'll have some of our audience participate, panel participate in this one. I'm going to ask you, Bob, you sit on the Broadband Commission, as do a number of us here.
With you and Eva.
And we focus on different areas on the IT Broadband Commission, but you see the progress in the number of national plans, the number of countries that.
Yeah.
Can you give us maybe a quick comment on what you're seeing there and what's being encouraged and the importance of that?
So, as part of one of the core recommendations of the UN Broadband Commission was that every country should develop a national broadband plan or strategy. It can have different names. We've seen dramatically over the last 5 years the number of countries having plans grow and grow significantly. It's now over 160 countries globally, approaching 170. But more importantly, we actually asked a question with the Broadband Commission a year ago. And so just about a year ago, we released a study. The question we asked, right, because we were assuming that if you have a broadband plan, it actually is a good thing. But empirically, does it? Does having a plan make a difference? So what we did was we actually looked at a time series, 10 years of data, 160 countries. So it's not just correlational, but using what's a methodology called a panel regression. It's actual causality. And we had 4 important takeaways. Having a plan does make a difference. In fact, we found that if you have a plan, because it focuses a national agenda, it's about leadership, just having a plan can increase fixed broadband by 25%, and it can increase mobile broadband adoption by over 30%. So having a plan actually moves the needle significantly on adoption of broadband in a country. Second conclusion, competition matters. What we found was in mobile, if you have competition versus monopoly, a competitive mobile broadband environment more than doubles mobile broadband adoption. Competition is critical, and we know this, for example, from the examples that the minister just talked about in Macedonia. Third, public-private partnerships are key. Governments that go it alone with government-owned networks or more government control or government directly operating, investing, or coordinating is not as effective as when there is private sector investment, because private sector makes most of the investment. On the flip side, if it's purely private sector with no government involvement, it leaves gaps. And so you need the government setting out the goals, the framework, the objectives, the policies, as we just heard, and then attracting the private investment. So a private sector investment with government partnership is much more effective than either or going it alone. And fourth, broadband plans need a regular review and to be refreshed. The market is moving very dynamically. You have to refresh the plans, every 18 months, 24 months. We found that the average broadband plan was 7 years old, right? That's way, way too old, because the market is far too dynamic, the technological changes are too dynamic and changing, and the plans need to be constantly updated and refreshed.
And I'll add a comment here. I've just, in the last 10 days, looked at the Broadband National Plan of Indonesia. I don't think that plan existed 4 years ago. And if you look at it today and look at some of the capabilities in there, it's stunning in terms of its completeness, it's up to date. Some of the recommendations in there, the directions, I'm really very, very impressed in that area. And that's the 4th most populous country in the world. Carlos Lopez, you had some great insights on national plans, regional and local, and some of the interrelations there in Mexico, but they're relevant for every country on the planet, I think. Can you maybe share some of those with us? Because I think they're very valuable to the audience.
Thank you, John. Thank you, yeah. Definitely the national agendas are the first step and most important, because it has to be driven from the top. But let me put an example of why you need a strong coordination between national or federal, state and local policies. And I will public services as an example, and I will talk about the Mexican reality, but I am sure this applies to most emerging economies. For public services, and I will again put the example of Mexico. For example, tax collection at the federal state has been web-enabled for years. So we do pay taxes. Those that are in the formal economy pay taxes via a web page and web services for many years, and that is good. For example, there are many other services that need to be enabled, and in our reality, health services, for example, we have health services that are provided at the federal level with IMSS or ISTE or the Army or Pemex services. We have federal concessions that certainly are driven at the federal level, like road concessions, of course, telecommunication networks, energy generation, etc. Those are concessions that are driven nationally. The federal justice processes, of course, are run centralized, and some utilities in Mexico that are still federal provided, like power, electricity is driven by the CFE or gasoline in Pemex, which is going to change in the next few years, but this is still very centralized. Now, as far as state, we need states also to provide web-enabled or e-government services, because there are some health services that are provided at the state level, not only at the federal level. There are tax collections that happen at the state level, certainly justice processes that are local and not federal, and some concessions are also driven at the state level. Now, most importantly for the rest of the population is the local authorities and the local enabled services. There are things like property registry and taxes that are paid at the local level and that are still not e-government or web-enabled. So you have to do cumbersome paperwork to register your home or to register your small or medium enterprise. You have some other services like utilities, like water is locally provided. That's not state or federal. Newborn registry is local by any means. You have to register your kid in your municipality, within your county, and there are many other services that are related to locally delivered services. Now, today people have to travel dozens of miles and make lines and make cumbersome paperwork, both for local and state provided services. Some of the federal services are already enabled, but imagine the change in the quality of life of people that eventually can pay taxes or can make a registry for their small business with e-government. That is going to be certainly one means of getting more people into the formal economy. Today in Mexico there's a very large population that does not pay taxes because it is very difficult to pay taxes. So we have to enable web services or of course the broadband to enable local, state and federal provided services.
And I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later when we talk about demand and reaching people, because it touches everyone. But I'm going to move to the third subject, which is the affordability for the underserved, and I'll bring in a number of the panelists on that one on here. I think probably one of the ways to look at this, or certainly the way I try and look at this, is describe the model in the Broadband Commission. It's in the report of the State of Broadband 2014. I'll show you some of these reports in a minute. You look at the world as a pyramid maybe and say, look, there's over 7 billion people in the world. The top 2 billion, most of those being in the developed economies, they can afford unlimited internet access and pay $30 a month. Not a challenge, not an issue. But if you look at that $30 a month and take that into Africa, about 1% of Africans can afford that, 3% of Indians can afford it, 3 or 4% of Indonesians can, and it really becomes very limited. And so you have a business model at the top that's pushing down. And what's happened there is computers have got cheaper, tablets have hit $100 and less, smartphones have moved less down, though less prices on smartphones. You can see in many countries in the world, in China, in Asia, $50 smartphones, tests on smartphones that are lower than that. And so the devices are coming down. And what's happened is the same model on the service that was the prepaid voice has moved to prepaid broadband, and that's pushed down. In places like India, you can buy a gigabyte of download for about $1, and it can last you a month. And if you're a university student, you're on the LAN all day long, you have this in the evening, and you can make it last that long. You just can't download 20 movies a day, but you can do your work, you can run your business. You just have to manage this like a lot of the developing world manages prepaid electricity, prepaid gas, many of the prepaid utilities. They do it that way, they learn to do it that way, and I've seen it working beautifully on broadband. That brings it down to the third billion. So in more of the developing economies, you can start to see not just a few percent can afford, but the 30 and 40% can afford $1 and $2 top-ups on broadband regularly. Now that business model is stronger in Asia. It really started there 2 years ago, and Asia has probably been the leader on that. Every major telecom in Africa has adopted that business model, so you can reach much more than a few percent Africans. It can push down into that third billion and beyond. Latin America has probably been one of the slower geographies to adopt the prepaid model on broadband. He was the leader on voice, probably later on broadband, and one of the biggest inhibitors is a lot of the services, the data expires in the evening, and then you have to pay again tomorrow. So it doesn't roll over like you do on voice. That limits, with capabilities we have today, pushing that down into more people in the stack. So I'd encourage that, and the benchmark is, I think Asia's about 2 years ahead on this. Africa's doing fine. Latin America has all the things in place, but it's a case of bringing that business model. Now when you come from the bottom of the pyramid, there's 2.4 billion people in the world that live on $2 a day or less, the poverty line. So 3 to 5% of that to be spent on a device and service means they can spend $2 a month. That means they can't afford a device and service. So you're in a mode there where you need government help, government subsidies, and programs to drive that. I've seen lots of areas, for example in India, where you have shared access. Ladies in the village have 1 or 2 computers, or 3 or 4 computers. They provide service to 500 villages. They each pay a few rupees, and the ladies get certified to be the agent for the bank, the agent for the government services. Sometimes they train people. There's the private services, but they become certified, and it's well organized in an area like that. We ran an event here with regulators just last week in Guadalajara, a number of countries from Latin America, and I was really delighted to see some of the progress there in reaching the bottom of the pyramid. Costa Rica reached into their $200 million of Universal Service Fund and 3G license fees they've been collecting for the past several years, and said, for $50 million of this, I can reach the bottom 200,000 homes and equip them. Well, 200,000 homes probably means 1 million people. In a population of 4 million people, it means they're reaching that bottom of the pyramid, but they're using that Universal Service Fund, the tax on the phone and telecom licenses, to put that back into reaching lower income people that then become customers of the telecom. So I'm taking the money out to put it back to reach the bottom of the pyramid, which was the whole purpose of Universal Fund in voice phones 3 decades ago. And so they're doing that. You're seeing a number of that, but it's literally business model has to push down, and with cheaper devices, cheaper service plans, and government help and private public partnerships, and sometimes subsidies has to push up from the bottom, but it has to be done in an intelligent way, because you can't subsidize everything for 2 to 3 billion people on the planet. The ladies in India, for example, earn $100 a month providing those services. They have a job. They're motivated. They want to do a great job of this. They want to keep open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to earn money. And so it becomes a little bit more sustainable. But that process of that shared access in India took government help to set it up, and a lot of private industry training, because we was involved in that. One digital literate person per family. So I think you have to think of it from both ends of the spectrum there.